This is Buried in Our Past, Hidden Histories podcast of Westport Museum for History and Culture and the Westport Library, where you'll hear untold accounts of American history. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, I'm Ramin Ganeshram, the Executive Director of the Westport Museum for History and Culture, and I'm here with my friend and Westport Museum board member, Greg Porretta.
Hi, Ramin.
Hi, Greg.
Glad to be here.
Thank you. I'm glad to have you here with me so I can tell you a story that I bet you think you know, because we all think we know the story I'm about to tell you, but you probably don't. So I'm going to start with a question.
Okay.
And the question is, tell me what you think of when I say to you, what is the story of Thanksgiving?
Well, I think we've all been told that story many times since we were young, right? I can remember being a kid and getting together and getting the crepe paper out and making a pilgrim's hat and the Indian, headband. And pilgrims and the Indians got together and they were friends and they celebrated being, kind of together and, supportive and this type of thing and getting to know each other. This sort of,
this
nice
sort of
picture and all the paintings we've certainly seen over the years as well.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And what were you told about pilgrims? Do you remember? What were we all told about pilgrims? Why did they come here?
Well, yeah, the Mayflower, right? I'm really just going back to like elementary school when it was introduced to me.
And religious freedom.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly,
Okay.
right. Yeah.
Right. And then my last question for you is, what are the things that we eat today that are supposed to basically mimic that first Thanksgiving, which was in 1621, by the way.
Right. Well, we still eat these things, right? We got the turkey.
Yeah.
We got the cranberry sauce.
Yep.
All of the things and vegetables and gourds and all the
pumpkin pie,
all that stuff, which I happen to like a lot. Actually, it's one of my favorite meals, but of the year.
I think for a lot of people, it's the favorite meal of the year, right?
Although I think turkey is sort of like overblown. I mean, it's like once a year, I think ultimately is just fine for me with turkey, but I do enjoy it.
Okay. Well, so let's talk about all of this. So the first thing I want to say to you is, as I guess I know you can guess, what I'm about to say is that story is pretty much not true, end to end, right? And I want to start with telling you the story of the Pilgrims, which we're all told were people who came here to North America, to Massachusetts, for the purpose of religious freedom. And that's only part of the story. So the truth of the matter is, and I often say this in this way, America was a company store. And what do I mean by that? America was settled by corporations. The Virginia Company settled Jamestown, and the London Company settled, or the Plymouth Bay Company was also called, settled Massachusetts, right? And the purpose was very much a corporate purpose, to send people here to work the land, to take advantage of the natural resources, to trade with the native people for some of those resources. And in return for this, for being an employee of the store, you were set up with a passage, with some land to work, which you eventually had to kind of work off, to be able to claim it outright as your own. So it was a corporate relationship. They were employees of the London Company. Did they come here for religious freedom? Yes, they did. They were very much I don't even like to use the word persecuted, but they were thought of very poorly in Europe. These particular pilgrims had actually not come directly from England. They were living in the Netherlands. Their group was living in the Netherlands because they had been expelled from England and then returned, obviously, to come here to North America. And, the truth of the matter is they were thought of as very extreme religious fundamentalists. So that's kind of an interesting idea, right? We talk about this in our own modern time, religious fundamentalism, extremism, regardless of the religious sect we're talking about, right? We talk about this a lot. They were considered extremists, fundamentalist extremists, and they took advantage of this corporate opportunity to get out of Dodge, basically. So Does that gel with anything you were talking?
Well, not really. I mean, thinking so the corporate mentality kind of came overseas, across the pond, as they say. But my question is, in terms of sponsorship, so you have this group of people.
Right.
And as you mentioned, right, of course, religious freedom. And right, that is the story that I've certainly heard, over and over, and certainly as a young boy. And that was the spirit of this journey. And there was something in some ways almost pristine and heroic about it, right? It was like, taking this journey based on belief, and escaping some level of oppression, But what you're saying, what I hear you saying, is that it was, much more rooted in some of the things that we're familiar with, in our present day society, underlying most of the actions that we see unfold before us in society, which is, the corporate, what's the bottom line, where's the benefit, where's the value, and this type of thing. So that's interesting.
Right. I mean, so the corporate methodology of coming here and being employees of the company were a means to an end, which was to get out of a place that didn't want them, and they were actually in danger because of their views. But ultimately, it was a transaction, right?
How did they engage? So you've got, as they say, the kind of the corporate sponsorship, but what was the nature of the relationship? What was the connection? How did they connect to the
company?
Exactly.
Yeah, so it was just like now. There were agents, there were ads. Agents kind of went out and kind of recruited people. There were ads in newspapers saying that people were being sought. Information was given like through the local churches, all the networks of information that were common at the time, right? And so they learned, as did other people, for other voyages that were not religiously based. Jamestown is a good example of that, that this opportunity came about. So they're here, right? They get here in 19 or 20. And we all know the story. Then what happens, right? They have this terrible winter. They cannot survive. The winters here are much colder than they are in England. People die. There's not enough food. And then they finally make it through the year, and they make it through the next harvest year. And come fall 1621, they are celebrating the fact that they survived, right? Okay. And so that's the Thanksgiving story, that they have this big feast, as you said, with the native people. And we like to think it was in November. It probably was not in November. It was somewhere around September, October, if not, August. In fact, we do know the date or the time of year exactly from a letter by a man named Edward Winslow. It was written in December of 1621, and he describes this event. So it happens, remember, it takes quite a few weeks for ships to go between, England and North America, at least a month. So it happened sometime in the fall. We don't know that it was necessarily November. Right. We'll talk about why it's November now in a little bit. This is really interesting. Yeah. So Edward Winslow says, first of all, we planted all these crops. They didn't really do well, but, the corn came out okay. Right. So we had corn. And then we did have, he says that they go hunting. 4 men were sent out to do fowling, in other words, to hunt wild birds. And they killed a lot of wild birds. And then they had the company of some indigenous people, about 90 men with their king Massasoit, right? And he says, for 3 days, we entertained and feasted. And they, meaning the indigenous people, went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor and upon the captain and others. So, first of all, we don't know that there was any turkey. Was wild turkey common? Of course, it was then as it is now. We don't know for sure that that was what they ate. We do know that they likely did eat some kind of baked mashed pumpkin dish. That likely wasn't sweetened, right? Sugar was really expensive. The idea that maple syrup was widely used to sweeten things is a myth that actually is not true in this period of time in the 17th century. There was a lot of deer. They ate mostly venison at that first Thanksgiving. Probably did eat cranberries. Cranberries were commonly eaten by Native people. And as you said, there were gourds and squashes and things like that. Probably not potatoes. Potatoes were actually in this period of time considered a delicacy. They were, largely in South America. They really were just becoming more available to common people in Europe at this time. So probably not potatoes. And a lot of corn. And so how would the corn be eaten? It wasn't eaten fresh on the cob. It was probably dried. It was probably in a cornmeal mush type of thing, a rudimentary sort of cornbread, like a griddle cake. So there are some echoes of that meal, but the meal that we eat now as very symbolic of that 1621 feast, not very much related in terms of what was eaten. And also it wasn't one day. They had this feasting for like 3 or 4 days. He says there were 90 Native men. And then, of course, whoever was in the settlement. So that's pretty interesting.
So this gentleman writes this letter, and who is he sending it to? You said getting overseas, it takes a certain amount of time. You say December, he arrives in December. So he's communicating to family back home, or what's the deal?
It's a friend. He says, loving an old friend, although I received no letter from you by this ship, yet for as much as I know, you expect the performance of my promise. Meaning, I know that, he says, I didn't get a letter from you, but I know you would want me to write you. Right. And so I'm writing this to you.
So how does he frame this event to his friend? It's a fascinating story in some ways. I mean, I can imagine his friend receiving this and saying, wow, this is really nothing that I see in my day to day. What an interesting thing to read. But how does he communicate this to his friend? Here's the event. Here's what the genesis of this event was. This is the idea behind it. Of course, and this is going to be my second question too, is the evolution of this holiday of Thanksgiving. How did that occur? And we'll get to that, I'm sure.
Sure. So basically what he's saying to his friend is, let me tell you what's been going on here. Right? We got here, we planted these crops, some did well. He says, our barley was indifferent good, meaning it was kind of metza. It was all right. Our peas were not worth gathering, right? Because they were sown too late. And what we understand from this is they still don't understand the seasons. They don't understand the geography, the climate. So they're guessing. And so this is a report of saying, here's what's been happening to us. Right. And then he's saying, finally, when we made it through, we had this feast to give thanks. He's very clear about that, right? It's a thankfulness feast. So in the idea that it is a feast of giving thanks, Thanksgiving, yes, it was. But what was eaten was not, what we eat now.
Sure.
And I'm sure you can guess this idea. He does actually say here, the Indians are very friendly to us. And we have this very lovely, friendly relationship in that moment in time. And that's through this mythology of this kind of, Native people wanting to help the Europeans and having this relationship and this Feast of Thanksgiving really comes from. I think what's important to know, and I think what a lot of people don't know, is that those moments of now we're at peace, we're getting along great, was momentary. And then next month we could be fighting. And 6 months from now we could be friends again. People are complex.
Well, we all know, of course, how the story evolved and unfolded as the years passed. And there's, tremendous amount of material, heartbreaking and this type of thing, of what occurred. But I'm wondering, do we have any other letters from this individual talking about those relationships, and because as you say, he's communicating to his friend about this event of giving thanks, and he reports, it sounds to me like he's reporting, representing a certain kind of relationship with the indigenous people, which sounds friendly, as you say.
At that moment.
But I'm just curious, is there any other reports from him about that?
So not from him, but there are other reports. Remember, this was a company, right? So the colonial governor, who was employed essentially by the company on behalf of the king, was sending reports back to England. So that's how we know as much as we know about what was the winter like, how were their interaction with the native people at that period of time. And so, or how we have accounts is by it's almost always people in service of kind of their job. So we have a count here in Connecticut from 1614 by Adrian Block, who was Dutch. And it was the Dutch really who first colonized and made settlements in Connecticut. And he was exploring the Connecticut River. And he says in 1614, he says the natives there, this is South Windsor, plant maize. And in the year 1614, they had a village resembling a fort for protection against the attacks of their enemies. And so those enemies are not Europeans at that period of time. It's other tribal people, right? And then he talks about the river and so on. And so, but he's making this report because he works for somebody as a privateer, basically. He's working as a paid explorer. So that's how we know this. But let's talk about Connecticut a little bit before we even talk about, how did Thanksgiving come to be Thanksgiving? So Connecticut in this period of time was, as I said, first settled by the Dutch, largely as a trading port. The English tried to make inroads. It's kind of little skirmishes between the Dutch and the English. But it is about 15 years after that first Thanksgiving in Plymouth that a group of Puritan leaders, Pilgrim leaders, decide that they want to settle Connecticut. And I think the reason is super interesting. Do you want to guess why? Like, why would they say 15 years, we've established ourselves. This is good. We have our villages. We know how to plant.
Yeah.
Everything is good.
Well,
let's go to Connecticut.
So you're saying they're not there. They moved to Connecticut. Say, this
Yes,
is a good place
a group
to settle?
decided to basically leave Plymouth, leave Massachusetts, and go into Connecticut, the Connecticut colony, to settle the Connecticut.
I mean, I can only guess. I don't know. Resources, money, power. I mean, it's got to be about expanding the fiefdom in some sense. Am I wrong?
So probably some as a secondary endeavor. The idea of expanding one's power, yes, it's always that, right? There were, which you have to understand about North America in that period of time, the amount of resources here was staggering to the Europeans.
Of course.
Timber, animals in the forest, fish in the sea, wild fruits and plants. It was completely mind-blowing to them how much was here. So it really wasn't a matter of resources. Oh, we don't have enough in Massachusetts, in Cape Cod, and we got to go down to Connecticut. No, that's not why. The reason is because as the Puritans and the Pilgrims of Massachusetts, there was a certain group among them who, to simplify it, felt that they were not Puritan enough. So a group of men led by Thomas Hooker decides, you guys are a little lax here in your Puritanism, right? Like, you're not really as strictly faithful as you should be. I'm going to go and create a new settlement where I can, and we can have stricter rules. So now understand that this was a society that was not unlike a lot of what we would now consider repressive societies today, right? It was a religious-based society. You had to spend all day in church on Sunday. If you were not in church on Sunday, you could be fined. You could be put in jail. Women had to wear modest clothing. Anything that was deemed inappropriate could be punishable by jail, by corporal punishment. We know certainly that if someone was accused of witchcraft, right, and that could be virtually anybody, the punishment was death, right? So this is a very severe society as it is. But Thomas Hooker decides it's not severe enough.
I see. So are you saying more maybe fundamentalist?
Much more fundamentalist.
Yeah, that's in some ways not an uncommon story, and one that I think has been repeated in many communities through history. I mean, you can jump to the Mormons and the FLDS, in terms of what's happening there. And if you look at the history of Mormonism, polygamy is not something we do anymore, and et cetera, et cetera. And, but yeah, there are branches that left that main, in some ways for the same reason. And you could certainly get the microscope out or your magnifying glass and say, what's really going on here? But that motivation,
Right.
something that exists in and can emerge in communities. And so it sounds like that's what happened.
And that's exactly what happened, right? So Connecticut essentially is much more Puritan than Massachusetts. They settle at the Huis de Hoop, which is Fort Hope, a Dutch settlement. It's Hartford, became Hartford. They called it Hertford or Hereford after a town in England where Hooker had associations. And, essentially they created this super fundamentalist colony. Sometime later, maybe within a few years later, there is a settlement of New Haven, which in itself is super interesting because what you have is a man named John Davenport, a reverend, decides that those fundamentalist guys up in Hartford and in Wethersfield, in these original towns, not strict enough also. And he settles New Haven. It's a rogue colony. And that's a whole aspect of Connecticut colonial history. But what I want to tell you is that so were there feasts of Thanksgiving here in Connecticut? And the answer is almost certainly yes, because feasts of Thanksgiving were very common in these religious societies. The purpose was very specifically to gather and thank God for, the ability to settle a colony, to weather difficult circumstances. Wealthy people might have created feasts of Thanksgiving for very personal reasons. Right. My child was sick and now is not, that type of thing. So there certainly were. The descriptions we have relating to the native people are very similar to, in terms of foodways, right, to what we see in that letter, right? That 1621 letter, maize, corn, right? A lot of hunting. Depending where indigenous people were. Obviously, the Massasoit were on coastal Massachusetts, so there was, clams, and we know that there was lobster. The letter goes on to talk about lobster, clams, so on, at that first Thanksgiving. And for coastal Connecticut, it would not have been dissimilar at all. Do we have definitive examples of big Thanksgiving feasts, including indigenous people in Connecticut? Not necessarily, right? But certainly those types of things, with or without a cross-cultural element, happened. So having said that, how did Thanksgiving come to be?
Yeah, well, I'm listening to you share this, and what I'm hearing is that, you have this. And this kind of relates back to my own exposure to this story as a young boy in school, and the first Thanksgiving. There's a kind of fixation on the first Thanksgiving. And by the way, I don't know the name of this person. I wasn't introduced to the name of this individual who wrote this letter, this first kind of gathering. But it sounds like what you're saying is that it, in some ways, is a bit of a tradition or a kind of something that the people of the time return to on a regular basis. So it sounds like there is a traditional aspect to it. So it's not necessarily like, we have this letter the first time. It sounds to me like there may have been a time before that too.
Right.
I'm not sure, but...
that's a really good point. So Edward Winslow writes his letter in 1621. They had only been there a year. So there hadn't been a time before that in that community. But, in Europe, absolutely. Right. And that's a really good point. It was a traditional way to celebrate good fortune.
Exactly.
Right. And so in writing this letter back to his friend in England, that person would have fully understood what that meant.
There you go.
Right? That we had 3 days and we all got together and we ate and we celebrated. It would have been, that person would have said, yep, I get exactly what's going on here.
And I can imagine it's a way for that individual here in this country, to affirm that connection to his own tradition, his own understanding of what they would do to express gratitude in a communal way.
Right.
So, yeah.
And it was also a way of saying, we've come here, we've set up this settlement, we've set up this colony, and we are engaging in our ways. We're recreating our way of life here.
Right.
We may be in the wilderness, but we're not, completely devoid of our customary traditions.
Here's another question I have for you. So with this individual writing this letter, and again, going back to the whole thing of religious freedom, how was the element, I'm just curious, in this letter, were there any religious elements represented in this letter to his friend, in terms of sharing, I don't know what you want to call it, belief at this point? Obviously, we know that there was a good amount of proselytizing, in coming here and meeting the indigenous people, and that went on for many, many years. And, continues. Yes. That's a big part of the faith, I think, right? So I'm just curious if that's represented at all in those letters. In
absolutely.
That letter,
and he's very careful to make sure, I think, that element is there. He says, and although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God, we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty. So what he's saying that, it's not always as plentiful as it was on that day, on that Thanksgiving day. But because of the goodness of God, we're okay. We're surviving, and in fact, we have so much thanks to God. Right. I wish you were here to have so much with us. And the fact is that, truthfully, that was not the case. Like the myth that we enjoy in this country is that first year was hard. Yep. The Thanksgiving feast happened, and from there on forward, there was it wasn't hard. Yeah. They figured out how to plant crops. They figured how to save food. It was plentiful. Yeah. And that wasn't exactly the case. I mean, had they chose to live completely in the manner of the native people, then it would be plentiful. Right. But they were, forcing this square peg of European farming practices and lifestyles in the round hole of the New World, the quote-unquote New World. And so it wasn't always plentiful. But he says it is. And he says that, we're okay, and it's because of God. Later he says, it has pleased God so to possess the Indians with a fear of us and love unto us, that not only the greatest king amongst them, called Massasoit, but all the princes and people round about us have either made suit unto us or been glad of any occasion to make peace for us. Like in our modern idea, we're like, that's insane. So what he's saying is that God decided to make them afraid of us. And because they're so afraid of us, there's nothing they won't do to be peaceful and loving to us. Right. Because, the subtext is God made us better than them. Right.
So you have this event, it occurs, you've got a group of people, and then you have a person that is framing, the meaning behind the interaction. Right. Which is interesting.
So what's really interesting to me is that when you read this letter, and you understand the cultural context, were they to be here today, other than being generally horrified by everything they see around them, and they came to Thanksgiving at whosever home it was, they would understand that. They'd say something good has happened, and these people are getting together to say thank you. Even during the Revolutionary War, Washington's generals and Washington himself proclaimed days of Thanksgiving specifically for the purpose of giving thanks to God for winning key battles multiple times. He had a Thanksgiving that he proclaimed while he was president in Philadelphia, and before that, when he was in New York, when the presidency was in New York, again, basically to proclaim thanks for the ratification of the Constitution. That Thanksgiving, to give thanks for the Constitution, and the Congress actually achieved this great event of ratifying the Constitution, happened to be Thursday, November 26th. Oh. It was a Thursday. It was the fourth Thursday in November, which is when we celebrate it. Right. But that did not become a regular event in the way that we think about it, right? At some point in the 19th century, people started celebrating it in that way, but very loosely. Some people did and some people didn't. It was actually the editor of the Ladies' Godey's book, Sarah Josepha Hale, who went to Lincoln during the Civil War and convinced him that that day, that fourth Thursday in November, should be a national holiday, specifically as a way to show, thanks for the Union and thanks for, the friendship and the amity that should exist between all Americans. Right. It was meant to be a healing holiday.
Right.
And so he actually was the one, Abraham Lincoln was the one who proclaimed it a national holiday. Right. And so it has been ever since.
Wow.
Yes, but it's not quite what people think it is.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I feel like I've learned some things in terms of the evolution of that event, but I've always been curious. I mean, your last point about how it was, selected as a standard yearly event. I wasn't aware of, how that occurred, but it sounds like it is something that has its roots in the culture that came here. That was something that
right.
existed as a regular touch point in their communal society, which they brought here. And of course, it's not like gratitude is something that exists only in one community. I think expressing gratitude is, as you say, it is a healing thing. And right. in that sense, I think every community will find value and importance in that. And I think that if you can, create an event around that, I think that's a pretty good thing.
I think you're 100% right. And I mean, and to your point, it was just their community. Mm-hmm. The real first quote unquote Thanksgiving celebration of giving thanks in the Americas was Francisco Vasquez de Coronado and the Teja Indians in Texas. And that was 1541, right? That isn't the story that we're told because, of course, that was a Spanish settlement, colony. But in fact, throughout Europe and throughout ancient cultures too, right? Just as you say, this is, I think it's a very human, a human desire to mark occasions and to make some big expression of thanks.
Yeah.
So with that, I thank you for listening to my story.
Thank you. I'm so glad to have heard it.
Thank you. And I wish you happy Thanksgiving.
And you too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been Buried in Our Past, Hidden Histories. We hope you enjoyed today's program. Learn more at westporthistory.org. You'll love what you learn.